As you know, William, this is one of my favorite photographs for obvious reasons, because here we talked about it a few days ago. We weren't quite sure. That's why I put circa. William sort of thinks he was, I think, possibly a bit older. I thought it was he would be roughly 3. But what makes the photo pertinent?
4.
50.
2.
No,
I'm assured by my wife, who remembers I was 2.
But no, well, if you're born in 55, I think it's 3. But what makes it pertinent, obviously, you have Morris in the foreground, Sydney in the middle, and then young William on his father's shoulders. So just a simple question around this photograph. I mean, if you can say something just about maybe your dad and his relationship to his dad, or how you saw it as a grandchild, or how they got on, or obviously
I've
they were
never
close.
asked that question to myself. And as a child, I think one has so little sense of, or I had at that age certainly, of my parents' relationship to their parents. I know that my mother wanted to be utterly different from her parents in style. I know that my great-grandfather was a chazan in the shul, and my grandfather was on the, sat in the box in his silk hat at the Wolmeron Street Shul in Hillbrow, and my parents wanted nothing to do with religion. So there were those kinds of shifts.
Well, we ask it more pertinently. Do you feel that because Morris, because it's interesting to say Morris had actually at St Andrews first elected, maybe it was through the family, to study medicine, but he realized very soon that actually it wasn't law that was his calling, it was politics, and he switched. So do you think that the fact that for Sydney, that his father was a lawyer, do you think that was quite important? Did it give him a certain early direction, and do you think he always knew he wanted to?
Well, my grandfather, who was a tiny, I think it was from malnutrition, he was a tiny person. He was sent to university at St Andrews when he was 14. And he was there with these huge rugby playing other people, and he was completely out of his depth. He spent a year there and didn't pass. And then he went to Glasgow University to study medicine, which is kind of the last thing he should have been doing either. He was a person who could not even, much less switch on a kettle. They used to have a manservant called Manas, and he used to say, I think it's 6 o'clock. Manas, could you switch on the wireless? So anything practical was like driving a car, out of the question. So I forgot what was the question.
No, just to ask if you think that Morris being a lawyer was.
No, my father's story of it was that he thought he was going to be a journalist. He did his undergraduate at Wits when he left school at 16 in 1938. So in 39 he went to Wits. And when he finished his undergraduate, he joined the army and was in the South African Air Force up through Africa and then through Italy. And right towards the end, there was a sergeant major, I think, who said they were doing some court-martials for minor infringements, and wouldn't he prosecute one of the cases? And my father said, well, he's never done any law. And the guy said, well, but you've got a university degree, that's enough. And he did it, and he actually thought, oh, I actually can do it, and I like it. So that's his story of how he became a lawyer. And he always said afterwards that he was a lawyer because he couldn't do anything else. When I was thinking, should I do law? And then I thought, no, I can't do law because I'm on a hiding to nothing to follow my father. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try out this art stuff for a while. And quite tentatively announced that to my family. My father said, oh, fantastic, my God, if I could do anything other than law, I would have done it. Why on earth would you want to do law, was his view. So I don't know that it went directly there, but if you look at it cumulatively, there've been a lot of lawyers, and it half skipped a generation. None of my parents' children became lawyers, although my sister studied the law, but my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, is an advocate, and a generation later, and my second daughter is an advocate here in Johannesburg. And
then just to add a little bit of context before we move to the next slide, if my information is correct, I think Sydney opened his practice in 1949 in Johannesburg. But again, like his father, I think credit to the British education system, because I didn't know that he was at Wits for a short time, but he was educated, his legal degree was done at Oxford University. So I really think it's incredible, like we know in so many fields, obviously particularly academic, that a lot of the studies have been done abroad, and particularly in England, being sort of at that point like within the British Empire. But yet that incredible training and those skills have been brought back to South Africa and used to great benefit, whether in architecture or in the law or in commerce or in any other way. So I think that's important as well, that Sydney did come back from England, and that I think one of his proudest moments still to this day is that obviously it took probably 15 years, if I'm not mistaken, from the time he opened his practice. But he's the only lawyer, I think, in history who's represented 3 Nobel laureates. So they would be, I'm just putting in the order of ages rather than when they received the award. Chief Albert Luthuli, Nelson Mandela, and Desmond Tutu. So the next, if we can move on to the next image, Jane. This is very interesting because this is a work that William made in 2013, hence you've got that brackets on the date. But the treason trial, which is, of course, we don't need to give it any introduction, was, I think, a trial that ran for 3 or 4 years. And I think the Nats, being as shrewd as they were, because most of the people arrested and detained and that were charged were from Johannesburg. Everyone, to try and minimize the unrest or the sort of the crowds that would be protesting outside. I think all the proceedings were held in Pretoria over this 4-year period. But maybe, William, if you can talk about the trees and the trials.
Yeah. So the trial started. The preliminary hearings were in fact at the drill hall, just behind the Joburg Art Gallery, and then it moved from there to the old synagogue in Pretoria, where many other political trials were held. Later, and I suppose that was the first time my father had Nelson Mandela, as a client. But before that, there'd been a connection when Mandela and Tambo had their legal offices near Diagonal Street, and they were attorneys. There were various cases in which Mandela, as an attorney, had briefed my father to appear for his clients. So there was a backwards and forwards connection there. The treason trials went on from when I was about 3 to when I was about 6. And every day my father would simply drive off going to Pretoria. And so the word of the phrase, the treason trial, was in the house over all those years and at that time. But in my head, I made the kind of association of the trees at the bottom of the garden. We had a whole lot of old pine trees, so those were the trees of the treason trial. And on our stoep, we had a little mosaic table, which we used to refer to as the tile table. We're going to have tea should we have tea outside on the stoep on the tile table? So for me, it was some connection between the trees at the bottom of the garden and the tiles here, the trees and tile. And in retrospect, that sort of stood me in good stead in the sense of thinking of the mixture between image and language and the resistance we have, or the need we have to make sense of fragments we don't understand, to make a possible coherence out of things which otherwise would be incoherent, kind of a productive mistranslation. And this was a lithograph printed by Mark Atwood near White River, of drawings with different phrases, which reference the treason trial, but also family picnics and things like that. There's a phrase which is salt in a twist of wax paper, the way we would always go when we had boiled eggs to a picnic. Always to the Magaliesberg, always getting lost. So we'd think we're going to go to a beautiful river, but we'll always end up at the side of the road next to some culvert and a barbed wire fence.
And then, William, something I would love to have been able to do, I think obviously because she was living with your dad in England for so many years, but obviously this fantastic, it's really a portrait of grace, and never mind beauty, but grace to me. As any child would know, I mean, just the care and the love that's displayed in this photograph from a mother to her son. But if you could just talk about your mom, but obviously from a legal perspective, but also as a mother. And then just one more thing to say, I know that you, through Bill Ainsley, and I think this is probably where you first got interested in art. She was clearly very interested in art, and you used to do life drawing classes in the afternoons or the evenings together, and if you can just talk about that a little.
Yeah, to back a little bit, it was, although the family was very much in the legal world, somehow both through my grandparents were very good friends of Taffy Whitman, the abstract Welsh painter who came to live here through his wife Adelie, who had Rand picture framers in the middle of town and art supply shop, and he was an artist, and also very good friends of Cecil Scottmas. So it didn't feel odd. You know, artists felt real. They weren't living in Paris with berets and a palette in their hands. You could go to artists' houses and they had an ordinary dining room table. It was, as well as a studio somewhere in the garden. But early on I was sent to art lessons, which went on through with, I'm sure some of you would remember the name Nina Campbell-Quine, who had her children's art school in Hyde Park. And then there's always the difficult transition from a children's art class to an art class that isn't for children or about children. And that happened through the artist Bill Ainsley. And my mother started to go in her mid-50s, I think she decided she wanted to do painting, and went to some of his life drawing classes, and I was then 14 or 15, and decided to join her, which was quite a thing for the son to be drawing next to his mother and suddenly there's a naked woman in front of you. So the first 4 minutes were maybe intensely embarrassing. And then it became, how the hell do you draw that leg? Where does that arm go to? Why is the hand like a little shrunken banana? How do we... and then there was a couple of years where we'd go to the same life drawing class in the evening, and then I started doing other courses. But Bill and later his school, the Johannesburg Art Foundation, was the primary arts education that I had. And then my mother, when she left, when my parents emigrated to London in the late 1980s, that was what she did essentially, was primarily painting.
And then can I ask, on the legal side, William, because obviously your mother was, like your father, an incredibly good lawyer in her own right, but as a result of your father's practice and also his fame and prominence, and then also the fact that she was a mom, was that one of the reasons you would say why she was not necessarily diminished, but somehow in the background, at least in the later years, where she wasn't?
Well, she had appeared certainly in the background when the children were young, where she would only work mornings and she'd come home every afternoon, and she was not happy with her practice. Then she had her prime, which was really her 50s and 60s, when she did the campus law clinic and the legal resources center. And then, in a sense, I think it was primarily my father who wanted to practice in London, and she went with him. And she was still connected to the legal resources center, but the day-to-day involvement in each of the details of the cases and things fell apart. So for her, it was a sadness, I think, leaving Johannesburg. And the painting was a compensation, but it didn't make up for it.